Do I have any artists in the audience? Oh, great. Visual artists? Nice. Writers? Right-wing radio talk show hosts? Cool. Yeah, I didn't expect that either. Well, for those of you who are here, let me relate something to you. Have you just been at your workspace, your desk, your easel, your studio, wherever, and your hands are furrowed in your brow as you massage the flesh of your forehead because you've been lost in a deep web of an identity crisis? This crisis, it isn't just a temporary snag, a quick dip in confidence, or an embarrassing gaffe of an otherwise perfect model of starving artistry. It's a deeply seated psychological issue, a strain on the psyche for which most of your life has kept you going, coherent, and maybe even strong, but now it has come to a head. It placed you there naked and dazed. It's the unrequited issue that hasn't been addressed, that was once hushed by your subconscious and has grown its sinewy tendrils to be a writhing monster fueled by neglect. That was a question, by the way. Just asking. For a friend. I see that in Roger Cobb, our main boy in the movie House, a film about confronting the demons of your past, and it makes these demons known by showing them, externalizing them in a way we artists, hell, anyone who does anything, feels. So yeah, come check this out with me on this episode of Movies from the Deep. House makes sure to tell us right out of the gate that we're in for something resembling the spooky. It begins with a visit from a grocery delivery boy to the titular house and discovering, to his dismay, an old lady who appears to have hanged herself. He does what a reasonable underpaid delivery boy does and runs like hell. Next, we find out about the author, Roger Cobb, our main boy, our protagonist. He's a horror novelist, and we get a sampling of just how popular he is. People from all walks of life come to his book signing, from punks to normal folk to more punks? Or is that new wave? But we find out soon that he is interested in writing about his time in the Vietnam War, and that seems to turn a lot of people off.
It's about my personal experiences in Vietnam.
The war?
Yeah, that's right.
Including his publisher.
Nobody wants to read about the goddamn Vietnam War anymore. They want to read a good horror story.
Frank, would you listen to me for a second, all right? I know this book has been giving me a problem, but it's something I have to do. I've got to write this book.
Cobb is stubborn and won't budge one iota, so naturally he moves into his late aunt's house to write it, therefore leading us off into the tickling, creepy feels of House. For a little background, House was directed by Steve Miner, who started his career as an assistant editor and production assistant on The Last House on the Left, and he'd go on to be the second unit director on Friday the 13th and directed parts 2 and 3. House, though, was the film he wanted to make a statement with. He had just come off a failed deal to bring Godzilla to the big screen before Toho reacquired the rights, so he found out from friend Ethan Wiley that he had written a screenplay about a haunted house with a lot of comedic elements in it to distinguish from other films like it. And also fishing. Miner was an avid fisher, and Ethan tried hard to ensure he'd make money by appealing to Miner's interests.
Abalone off of Point Ridge. Got it.
Oops, sorry about that.
For the cast, they chose actors who could balance the active straight man with comedic timing. Enter William Catt, who had just that, but also George Wendt, as nosy neighbor with a heart of gold, who you probably know from Cheers, in addition to old Vietnam buddy Richard Mole, who you probably know from Night Court. These important casting decisions not only work in service of getting butts in seats, but as pathos and levity. And its actors do a nice job of keeping it light despite its themes. The biggest, most important one is Cobb's background as a soldier. We see these experiences through flashbacks, and these could have been dark and gritty, but it's more comic, specifically because of Cobb's buddy Big Ben. Big Ben is a literally gigantic prankster, and spooks Roger with a snake right before they're ambushed.
All right. Hey, pipe down. Dan, what are you doing?
Nothing.
Shut up and listen, you big ox. We ain't fucking around anymore.
Ben's performance is outward and broad. Notice when he shoots wildly at the Vietnamese soldiers. It's like a cartoon version of a soldier. And I think this really sticks out in a later flashback. Roger and Ben are patrolling the jungle and Ben gets shot and tells Cobb to kill him, but he can't. And in this serious moment, he yells,
"Roger! I'll get you for this! I swear I will!"
And while the Vietnam scenes are kind of weird, it lands better in the context of the movie because other key performers keep it a little more subdued.
Howdy, neighbor.
Harold Gorton is Cobb's next door and very nosy neighbor. And he seems almost opposite of Big Ben. Not super distinguished, just some guy, really. He figures out almost immediately that his favorite author suddenly moved right next door, and his excitement is kinda normal.
This can't be, right? Roger Cobb, right?
Yeah, that's me.
And I really love the way he reacts when Cobb asks him to hunt a raccoon with him. But what makes him stand out is his caring, loyal dog attitude to Cobb. He sees quickly that Cobb is having trouble, seeing monsters in the closet and having a generally concerning thing going for him. There's a moment when Roger is trying to tell him about the monsters, and Harold tries to comfort him.
You think I'm,
No, not at all.
You do?
No.
Harold, as they're walking out, decides to grab Roger's address book. This made me cringe a bit, because this is a horror comedy with weird comedy interludes, and I thought he was going to make an ass out of himself. But he doesn't. He actually calls up Roger's ex-wife to tell her what's going on because he's genuinely concerned.
Strange things. Ghosts and stuff.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I think you ought to come up here and check the guy out.
I'll call him right away.
Well, all right. Go ahead and call him, and I'll just keep an eye on him up here for you, okay?
And Roger's ex-wife, Sandy, is a caring presence throughout the movie. While they clearly divorced, it doesn't seem out of animosity, but a rotten circumstance. And that circumstance is they lost a child. Literally lost. Like he was swept up by Roger's late aunt's house and they haven't seen him since.
It was the house that did it.
Right, Mrs. Hooper, we understand.
There's a scene I found touching where Sandy calls Roger just to make sure he's okay. And Roger pretends there's a party all around him to make it appear he is.
Doing this to yourself.
Okay.
Why can't you just...
Everybody, let's look happy.
Can you hold on just one second?
Hold on, wait, Sandy, I gotta go.
Roger,
Yeah?
Come on, babe, smile.
nothing.
But I appreciated seeing a man who has clear PTSD and has been through a tremendous loss, positively being supported by his more or less ad hoc community that honestly is concerned for him. While Sandy isn't a major part of the story, she makes an impact by just showing an effort. But Roger ultimately needs to help himself, and this is the reason he moved to his late aunt's house in the first place, for
Solitude.
Solitude, yes, right.
solitude. And despite the nosy neighbor Harold, he finds it. But a tempestuous mind cannot be quelled by just solitude, and Roger's is that. After settling in, he starts to write his novel and remembers Vietnam. And after the turbulence of that vision, he sees his son in the window and literally turns him off with his remote.
Daddy?
By then, his focus lapses, and then the monster in the closet jumps out and injures him. This becomes his new obsession, trying to document the happenings of the house. And he doesn't know it, but the physical manifestations of the house are made of his own experiences. As Roger discovers more of the house's secrets, his hallucinations become more vivid.
Where you going, little fella?
Most people don't see the demons, only Harold does, when he lets him in. I think this is a pretty clear metaphor about trauma and support. When Roger finally lets Harold in, he chooses to be helped by someone else and figures out, through that process, how to help himself. And at this point, he knows exactly what to do. He sees his aunt's painting, which shows where his kid is, and goes to the depths of the house, or his psyche, to finally confront his demons and save his child. It's more or less action-adventure from here, and he ends up not only saving his kid, but killing the demon version of Big Ben in the process.
So long, suck!
And thus, addressing his PTSD. And of course, Sandy shows up and the family is reunited at last. Phew, that's a lot of plot, huh? And a lot of pretty straightforward character development as well. And while Roger does find a way to confront his PTSD, it is a little simplistic. Like, we don't really get much of a sense of how he's harming himself, and we don't really get much of a sense of how the other characters around him are affected by his decisions. But I think the almost sitcom-like simplicity of how it treats PTSD ends up being more of a reward, a fictional conquest of a battle that is generally fraught with subtle complexities that this film doesn't touch. But that's not a weakness, mainly because of the characters who show compassion for the little community that helps him, and through his own determination, it becomes a pasteurized, fictionalized version of it, but it preaches the sermon with good faith. So the literal demons that formed in the house have been vanquished, and it turns out that what was needed was a helping heaping of family, friends, and self-determination. Honestly, that hits a soft spot for me. Like, you can see all the chaos of life around you and recede from it, but it only helps to an extent. Like, yeah, you can confront your demons more head-on that way, right? See them alone, in the dark, but you gotta stay self-aware, or your reality could shrink to something smaller and stifling. Being trapped in a negative space isn't any good for anyone. And it takes a lot of work, but other people who honestly care can work to generate the strength to help you get out of there. And, I'll take that cue.